Hi guys, welcome back to another video, or your first video here, I don't know. Welcome if you're new here, welcome either way. This is going to be my ever so slightly late March wrap up, part 2. And now moving on to 4 stars, I'm going to start off with Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo. This is the second book in the Shadow and Bone trilogy, and I am very excited to have finished this trilogy off so that I can now start in on other books in this universe. So I was about to just read the back to remind myself, and it's literally just a quote rather than actually having any of the synopsis. So overall with this series, starting off with Shadow and Bone, it is a young adult series where some people are born with a magical affiliation to a certain type of magic, and these people are screened and then sent away to hone that power. And in this, thank you, Reg. And in this universe, those people are not trusted. They are more feared than anything else, and we are following a pair of orphans, one of whom has magic, the other doesn't. And Alina, the one who has magic, she hid it away so that she wouldn't be separated from her best friend Mal, and her powers are revealed in kind of the worst way possible, which splits them apart. So I liked this. I liked the first book, and the reason why I'm continuing on in the series is because I really feel like I have the potential to love a book by this author. Do you have to do that right now? If you can hear very weird grunting noises, Reg has decided now he's going to chew on his toy. I won't go too much into the actual plot of this one because I feel like that will spoil the end of the first. However, this one followed some really interesting themes of the way that religion can be used in order to control people, and how dangerous blind belief and that control can be. And also in terms of relationships with people where someone doesn't allow the other person to change, or instead of moving with that change or having adult conversations where it's like, we don't fit together anymore because this is changing and I'm not, and like, but instead of having conversations like that, it felt very much like, I don't like the way you're changing, therefore change back so that I can be comfortable. And I think that that was a really interesting point made in here. This very much didn't feel like middle book syndrome. I pretty much enjoyed this to the same extent that I enjoyed the first book. The stakes were raised in here to a sufficient amount, and yes, this was a very enjoyable book, but I find with this series that the plot is definitely moved along by the romances at the centre. So I feel like it feels very young adult from a couple of years back rather than a current story where there are other things driving the plot rather than a romantic interest. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. So next we have a fun comic, and that is A Gentle Noble's Vacation Guide. So this feels very D&D tabletop game vibes. So we are following someone who is new to this world, and he decides to join a guild where they go on quests, and he teams up with someone who notoriously only works alone, and not very much plot happens from book to book. We are slowly, very, very slowly, I think, going to find out the backstory of the main character. It's very clear that he's not from around the area, very new to the way that things work, and doesn't give very much away about his background. And pretty much, again, I picked this up because it was queer. And yeah, I don't really have much else to say because I think that any more would be more spoiler territory, but I will be continuing on with this series. and I'll probably be able to explain more about the series as a whole once I finish, rather than with each individual book. Next, we have A Place Called No Homeland, which is a poetry collection, which I thought was really, really excellent. It had a lot of commentary on identity and culture and history and belonging. And yeah, I can't really say much else because it is a collection of poetry. There's no inherent plot, but the themes were really interesting. The writing was really beautiful and I thought it was excellent. Next, we have a book called I Hope We Choose Love, which is actually a non-fiction by a author who I've tried to read some of their fiction and it was far too metaphorical for me. The irony that the book I just mentioned is by the same author is not lost on me. This one worked so much better for me. There's a lot of commentary in here about the queer community and about the activism community as well, and the ways in which those two communities intersect and the things that aren't working right now, and also the ways in which we could do better. There are certain things that I disagree with, and I definitely feel like there's a certain amount of all or nothing approach that this author takes in some of the scenarios. But it really made me think about the way that people go about activism and the ways in which people can get caught up in certain parts of activism where the end goal isn't enough or doesn't actually change things for people on the ground, I should say, or having the lived experiences and the double standards that people have within certain communities. Like, for example, in times where people jump on the bandwagon and cancel someone online, this author made the point where someone is far more likely to be cancelled if they are viewed as someone who is expendable to the community they are in. And I thought that was a really interesting point. It really made me think, and I think that it was a really valuable reading experience for that. And now my dog wants water, of course he does. Okay, where were we? Oh, next is another book where when I was back at my parents', because of the lack of internet, I picked this up off the shelf. And that is, sorry, I've just run up the stairs. That is a Big Panda Tiny Dragon. Now this is very similar to, can I find it easily or should I just... Now this is very similar to The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse by Charlie Maxey, with the very swirly writing. I can't really read that, but in that it is a somewhat plotless book where the main point is having each page be a beautiful piece of artwork accompanying with a quote or something that's a little bit more inspirational. Personally, I found this having less plot than The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse, and I enjoyed the style of artwork ever so slightly less, so that's why it's getting a 4 stars. I thought it was a nice read, but I don't think it's going to stick with me the way that that other book has. Next we have Black Imagination, which is an anthology bringing together the voices of a number of Black artists, and I'm just going to look up a bit of how they described it because the content was so disparate. I'm going to struggle trying to find like a way to explain it, I think. Let's have a look. I feel like this sentence in the synopsis really perfectly describes what Black Imagination does, and Black Imagination presents an opportunity to understand the joy of Blackness without the lens of whiteness. I really think that perfectly encapsulates the aim of this anthology, and I thought it was really beautifully written and very thought-provoking, so I would highly recommend this. And lastly, for 4 stars, I have Wash Day Diaries. This is a graphic novel where it's kind of like a series of short stories. Each chapter follows a different member of this friendship group, where the day that this timeline is covering is their wash day, so the day that they decide to wash their hair. And I'm not going to say the theme, because it's not themed about washing their hair, it's the thing that ties the stories together. I guess their friendship is doing that. Anyway, I thought this was a really interesting collection. I thought that it had a really diverse range of opinions, and the women were all in very different stages of their life. I really loved how they all stuck up for one another, and their friendship was really beautiful. The one thing I really didn't like about it was the way in which one of the characters was clearly really struggling and trying to reach out for help. And when talking about going on prescription medication for depression, the reaction of some of the other characters was very much like, oh no, like don't do that, and really judgmental. And I don't want someone reading that to then be discouraged from seeking medical help when they really need it. So I thought that was going to come back around and have more of a discussion about that, and it really never did. So that's the only thing that bothered me about this, though. I thought it was a really beautiful graphic novel. And finally, on to my 5 stars, which I do have quite a number of this month. First being Sawkill Girls. I am so glad to have finally read this. It was going around BookTube a couple of years ago as like a favourite of pretty much everyone who read it, and I can definitely see why. So we are following mainly a girl who is moving to an island called Sawkill Rock, and her whole family are moving there after experiencing a personal tragedy. But this island community has a history where young girls have gone missing over time, but nobody seems to really care. And the narrative is split between the girl who is new and 2 other girls who are in different situations on the island. I thought that the vibes were incredibly creepy, but really atmospheric. I loved the very ambiguous horror vibes, and also I thought this had fantastic commentary, especially around the ways in which women are taken advantage of. So I thought this was an absolutely remarkable read, and I would highly recommend. Although if you've already heard about it, you've probably read it already, because I'm very late to the game with that. Next, we have My Great Giraffe by Brooke Tate. So this is a children's book, but I read it because it is illustrated and written by Brooke Tate, who is a performer, drag artist, and I saw one of their shows when they came to my town, which was a really lovely experience. And during the interval, they basically, for anyone who was still around in the interval, they decided to do a reading of this children's book that they wrote. So obviously I'm not the target demographic for this book, but I'm basically giving it a 5-star for the fact that it is absolutely perfect for what it is. I think that it had a really, really beautiful message. It is about a child who discovers that there is a giraffe in their garden, and it is about how the child wants to protect the giraffe and how the father of the child wants to make money off of it and their conflicts. So I thought this was really, really beautifully done. And yeah, if you have very small kids, I would highly recommend. Next, we have a couple more very short books that, again, I read at my parents' when the internet was down. So I don't know how universal this was, but we certainly grew up with these. So there is an artist who did a collection of paintings and poetry called the Flower Fairies, and they were often themed with different themes. So I read through the book of poetry and artwork for the summer collection, the autumn collection, and the alphabet collection. So these are just really, really stunning artworks, really lovely poetry about flowers and nature. And again, I feel like I'm giving this like a technical 5-star. It is absolutely perfect for what it is. Next, we have a short novella called Yellow Jessamine. I thought this was so fantastically creepy and gets across such an interesting, ambiguous horror vibe in such a short amount of time. It follows a main character who is a woman in a very male dominated field and is in mourning for a number of her family members where she's been left to take over the family business, and then a plague hits their town and it threatens everything that she holds dear, because it is thought that the plague was brought to their town on her ship. So she has to figure out what is going on and whether or not it was her and how to stop it before things get wildly out of hand. And I thought that the creepy nature magic was really, really excellent in here. It is also queer. I thought that the wonderful relationship that was woven throughout this without taking over the plot was really wonderful. It was wonderful to see the main character learning who they can trust and who they can put their confidence in. Next, we have a book called Believe Me, which is a memoir by Eddie Izzard, and I really love this. Part of me is kind of giving this a 5-star, as technically it's perfect for what it is, but also it was an incredibly enjoyable reading experience. I listened to the audiobook of this and I highly recommend that be the way that you experience it. Obviously, if that's not accessible for you, then that's completely fair. Pick up the physical copy if that's the way that you can and want to read it. But I definitely feel like my enjoyment was heightened because I listened to the audiobook. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that the way that it's written is very much the way that Eddie Izzard speaks and the way that she performs her comedy. So it is very stream of consciousness, very rambly, goes off on many different tangents, and hearing it in the cadence of their voice and the way that it's supposed to be read, I think definitely heightened the experience. And the fact that because of the rambly nature, the way it's written is that you have text and then you have footnotes, where you get far more out of the story if you read the footnotes alongside it. But because Eddie narrates the audiobook as well, they make commentary on certain other things or certain footnotes in the audiobook that isn't in the printed copy, which they call footnotes on footnotes. So I thought that it was a really wonderful experience. The only thing that really didn't work for me was just the overemphasis on football. Eddie's really into football, I'm not, and I just kind of zoned out a bit for those chapters. They really weren't for me. But yeah, I thought this was a really vulnerable look at being trans at a time where that definitely wasn't accepted, and also the ways in which Eddie really clawed their way up through comedy and worked incredibly hard to make a name for themselves, and I thought it was really good. Next, we have a reread, and that is Immaculate by Oliver Lansley. This is a play that I've reread probably about 5 times now. I think it's utterly fantastic. The basic premise is that we are following a woman who is very, very heavily pregnant and can't work out why, because of the fact that she hasn't had sex in over 9 months. And eventually more and more people arrive at her flat, either claiming to know or be the father of the child, one of whom is God and one of whom is the devil. And this is a hilarious comedy. I think that it has really, really great commentary on religion while also being incredibly respectful of it as well. I have a number of Christian friends who I've read this with, and they also found it incredibly funny. And I just think it's an excellent, excellent play. And yeah, I was introducing some of my friends to this, and so we had a read through together, and it was a really enjoyable evening. Next, I have a book that has been absolutely everywhere recently, and that is Sword Heart by T. Kingfisher. It's not by TJ Klune, is it? It is T. Kingfisher. I can't remember, I always get those authors mixed up. But anyway, this follows a This is a cozy fantasy novel, which I think is just a wonderful thing that people at the moment want more cozy, fun reads, and that is really blossoming as a subgenre at the moment. So we are following a woman who has come into a amount of money, and her family members do not want her to get this money. They don't understand why she's been the sole inheritor of the wealth of a dying family member, and they decide to sabotage her, and they essentially lock her up and only promise to release her if she marries her cousin, in which case they could legally get the money from her and then they could kill her off. And she can't work out a way to escape. She can't see any way out of the situation. And so she decides to end her life so that these family members will not get the money. She looks around the room at all these collectible things that her family have found over the years, and one of the things that she sees is a sword, and she thinks, ah, yes, I will use that to kill myself so that it could be quick and painless. And she deliberates, how am I going to do this? And so she decides to take the sword out of its sheath, prop it up somewhere, and sort of fall on it. And she decides to take off her clothes, essentially so that the sword won't get caught in the bones of her corset and end up with a very painful situation that doesn't end her life. I know that I said this was a very cozy fantasy. I know that it doesn't sound that way with someone planning to end their life, but then what happens is that when she unsheaths the sword, a warrior pops out of it, and he is now her sworn protector because she is the owner of the sword. And it's about how he protects her, but also how he's been stuck inside of this sword for years, since the last time he was drawn, and how he is not used to the ways in which people act nowadays, and they essentially go on the run from her family members who are trying to kill her. So this was an incredibly fun romp. I think that I can definitely see why it's really swept BookTube up this past year, and I would definitely reread this because it was a lot of fun. Next is one I definitely have a copy of, but I don't think it's in my pile of stuff I've read. So where have I put it? Okay, I know I have a copy of this somewhere, but I just can't find it. So I read a play called Girls and Boys. Now, I went into this with incredibly low expectations, mainly because this author wrote one of my least favourite books of all time, which is a play called DNA, which for some reason is performed in schools a lot. I really don't understand why it is so terrible, from the way it's written to the way that the plot develops. It was just completely awful. And this was one of the best sort of monologue plays I've ever read. Right, Rich, you're allowed back in if you're going to be quiet. And it follows a woman who is recounting or reliving a lot of key moments in her past, in her relationships. It perfectly balances some scenes where she's in the middle of a conversation with other people, and even though you don't have the other person speaking back to her, you really get a feel for the conversation they are having. And in other scenes where she's more talking directly to the audience and reflecting on something. And it has just such wonderful conversations about motherhood and relationships and toxic relationships, work dynamics. I really think that the scenes between her and her kids were really incredibly done. She very much isn't someone who is very natural with kids, despite the fact that she tries incredibly hard to be sympathetic to their problems. And there was a twist in here which I totally wasn't expecting. I was really taken aback by that, and I thought that it had excellent commentary on toxic people and grief, I think, was a really big theme in here. And there you have it. Those are all the books that I read in March. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear about a book that you've read and enjoyed recently, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.